Hey everyone, today we had a rush order for a white oak circle dining table. There's a couple details on this build that you might not have seen before, but I'll show you the whole process from start to finish, so make sure and stay tuned. So to give you a little backstory on how this project came about, I was approached by a local interior designer that I've worked with in the past. They were wrapping up the remodel of a short-term rental property in the area and needed a small dining table to fit the space well. Now this is a pretty standard request, but it was kind of a rush order. We needed it completed relatively quickly, and we had a pretty tight budget to work with. If you've ever done a home project, you know that it always takes longer than you think it's going to, and it costs more money than you think it's going to initially. And as a woodworker, it's really no different. It always ends up taking me longer to build things and costs a little bit more than I hoped that it would. If I was smart, I'd probably try to avoid jobs like this, but sometimes I just am a sucker for a good challenge, and I was actually really excited about this little build. One of the reasons I was excited for this build, like I mentioned in the intro of this video, is that it has a couple little details I was actually really excited to implement on one of my new projects. A couple of those details were planned, and one detail that was definitely not planned, but I think actually ended up making the project better overall. So we'll get to that a little bit later on in the video, but for now what you're seeing me doing here is just going through the whole process of taking my lumber and getting it all milled up. I buy my lumber pretty clean typically, meaning that it doesn't have a lot of defects. It's been surfaced on both sides and has one straight edge, so in theory I could just rip it down on the table saw right away and get right into the build. Essentially skipping the milling process and using the wood as is as it comes from the store definitely works, but I always find that I get the best results when I do the final milling myself, running through the jointer and the planer, just to make sure that everything is nice and square. After getting the layout of my boards figured out, I still had a couple bad joints, so I wanted to make sure and get that fixed before the glue up, so I took it over to the jointer, gave it one more pass, and that ended up solving the problem. If you have limited space in your home but are still wanting a table that can seat quite a few people, I would almost always recommend going for a circular design like this table is today. The reason I recommend that is because this table is only going to have a diameter of 52 inches, so just over 4 feet, yet it's going to be able to seat almost 8 people. Now, 8 people would be a little bit tight, it's probably more ideal for 6, but the fact that you can seat 8 people at something that's going to take up so little space at the end of the day is, I think, a really great advantage to have, and definitely a little bit better than a rectangular or square table that can be a little bit more limited. You might be looking at this glue up and thinking the tabletop is looking a little bit smaller than it should be, and that's because this is only part 1 of 2 of the tabletop. So I elected to do it in 2 separate glue ups because ultimately it just gets really stressful to try to glue up so many boards in such a wide width, and I find that gluing them up in 2 separate halves really just helps me keep better quality control throughout the process and makes me not super stressed throughout the whole glue up. After getting the second glue up done off camera, I put the 2 pieces together and still had a little bit of a rough joint in the middle. The one side had about a 1/16 of an inch bow to it, so rather than try to muscle this together during the glue up, I decided to add some dowels to act as an alignment tool throughout the course of the glue up. One of the best decisions I ever made was replacing the doweling jig that you saw me use just now. And it got the job done by definition, but really if you want any sort of precision and not have dowel holes drifting all over the place, this jig is not for you. So I upgraded to a self-centering one from Woodcraft, I believe it was, and let me tell you, life is a whole lot better when you don't hate your doweling jig. So if you're one of those people that are in the market for a doweling jig, just let me know. I'll give you a link, just don't buy that PowerTech one. Milling lumber and gluing up a tabletop is not traditionally the most exciting thing to watch, so I tend to breeze over those fairly quickly, but if there's any questions that you have on my process or why I do certain things, feel free to let me know in the comments. I'd be more than happy to help answer any questions you might have. I just don't want to bore you with not very exciting footage. And speaking of boring footage, here's 8.5 seconds of me sanding this tabletop. So really, I don't think I actually did spare you any of the boring details, but at least you'll know exactly what's going on, hopefully. With the sanding behind us, it's time to move on to actually cutting out the circle of this tabletop. After finding the center point, I start off by drilling a small hole that I'll use to attach my circle cutting jig. The easiest way to cut out a circle would probably be to just draw the circle on the piece of wood, then use a jigsaw to cut out that circle and a sander to clean up any of those rough edges. That would work, but the disadvantage of that is that you're not getting a perfect circle. It would look pretty good, but if you really paid attention, you'd be able to see little deviations in the curve, and that's just something that I don't want to have in my pieces. So I opted for this method, which essentially takes out all human error and leaves you with a perfect circle. What you saw me doing there is using my router and the circle jig to make a few light passes and create a groove of the circle all the way around. I then take my jigsaw and use it to get up close to that circle mark and just cut off the bulk of the waste. At this point, I'm ready to move on to the final step of cutting out this circle, and that is using a flush trim bit to clean up those nasty little edges. The bearing on this bit will sit right up against the circle groove that I cut earlier and leave us with a nice flush edge. Even though this circle cutting method is a little bit time consuming, I really love the end result and it leaves a nice clean edge to work with going forward. After getting the circle cut out, it was time to move on to fixing all the little imperfections in the tabletop. And fortunately, this table didn't have too many to fix. There were some on the top side and a few on the bottom that I ended up repairing, but all it takes is a little bit of CA glue and Accelerator, and these knots all but disappear. Typically, I use a clear CA glue for a lighter wood like this white oak, but for this one on the bottom, I tried black just to see how it would look, and I'm not sure if I like it or not. I'd be curious to see what you think, but it ended up working out okay, got the job done, and looked a whole lot better than just leaving it alone. After getting the knots filled, it was time to move on to the sanding of the tabletop. So I went all the way from 80 grit up to 180 grit, and a trick that I use to make sure that my sanding is accurate and even across the length of the table is just to put down some pencil marks to create a visual cue for where I've covered and where I haven't. So this helps me track to make sure I'm not over sanding or under sanding any certain areas. After getting the sanding finished up, I went ahead and hit both the top and bottom of this tabletop with an 1/8 inch roundover. This helps breaks the sharp edge on the table and just gives it a nice clean look overall and more put together. With the tabletop pretty much wrapped up, I went ahead and set that aside for the moment and moved on to the base assembly. Now if you remember from the very beginning of this video, the base of this table is going to have 4 legs and they're all going to be splayed and tapered. So I started off by getting my lumber just kind of milled down to the rough thickness that I wanted before taking it over to the table saw where I'm going to break it down into its individual pieces. So this is not going to be the final taper that we do. This is just to get it into manageable chunks so I can start cutting the angles I need on each piece. Designing furniture can definitely be a little bit tricky, and for these legs I ended up landing on a 12-degree angle, but the only way that I really came to that is kind of just by doing some test cuts on scrap pieces and seeing what angle I thought would look good compared to the rest of the table. So there's really no inherent meaning to that angle, except for that I thought it would look good and complement the piece well. Now, this works, but it definitely leaves a lot of room for error as far as cutting the wrong angle and not quite loving how it looks at the very end. So something that I recently implemented is actually taking each one of my pieces and throwing it into a 3D model so I can see what the piece will look like before I get into building, because that's the point of the project where things are a lot easier to fix and you're not trying to fix problems later down the road when the project is half built. While I'm no expert at the whole 3D modeling business, it has been very helpful for myself going into these builds, and it's been really valuable for clients so that we can look at the model and discuss it and make any changes that we want to, and they can kind of get a clear idea of what the finished piece is going to look like. There are lots of fancy woodworking joints out there, but the joint I decided to use to connect the legs to the stretchers going underneath the table is called a bridle joint. What you saw me doing just a minute ago is marking out the boards into 3 equal parts, and now I'm taking over the table saw, where for the legs, I'm removing the waste in the center, then for the cross stretchers, I'm removing the waste on the outside. So because of the taper, it made this a little bit more complicated, but all I'm doing right now is marking out the areas that I need to cut off on the cross supports. Some people are really into using hand tools to do woodworking, and if that's you, more power to you. I respect you a lot because I cheat most of the time and just use power tools, but for this instance, I thought that hand tools were kind of my best bet as far as getting these joints nice and crisp. So what you see me doing there is just cutting off the excess and the waste of the joint, then using chisels to actually clean up to the line where I need my joints to line up with each other. If you're a bit of a hand tool novice like myself, It can be really helpful to clamp a block down, and this just helps keep the chisel going down nice and straight so you get clean joint lines at the end of the day. After finishing the cleanup of all these different joints, it was time to move on to the very last joint that we had to cut for this base assembly. And all we're doing here is what's called a half lap joint. You cut half of the material away in one piece and half of the material away in the other piece, and then they merge together perfectly and create a solid joint. At least that's the theory. If you remember at the very beginning of the video, I said that there was a couple little details I was excited to implement, and one design element that ultimately added a lot to the build, but wasn't planned. And this was the not planned part. So I got into cutting the joiner for this, and it was all looking good. I was feeling really great about it. But what I didn't know at this point is that I had already made a fatal mistake, and something that actually could have been a really big deal. So I got through cutting my joints, and they're way too big. Turns out when you mix up the width and the thickness of your board, you make some mistakes and your joints fit the exact opposite way that they should. So I was a little bit panicked at this point because, like I said, I was on a bit of a time frame for this project, and we needed to get it done really quickly, meaning that I didn't have time to go to the lumber store and buy more wood, let it acclimate, and all that kind of stuff. So what I ended up coming up with was this little fix. So basically my thought process was to use these pieces as a way to fill up all the loose space in that joint, and after glue, we should have something nice and secure for the middle of our table base. These pieces were pretty delicate and small, so some of these cuts were a little bit scary to make on the table saw, so I probably wouldn't do this again if I had the choice, but ended up working out pretty good, and as you'll see here in just a second, ended up being just what we needed for this base. At this point, we can kind of see how this table base is going to come together as we begin gluing up the first half of our table base on those brattle joints that we cut a little bit earlier on in the video. After getting both the table base components glued up, I went ahead and sanded them up to 180 grip just like the tabletop off camera. And at this point, the joints were looking really good, they were looking really clean, but I wanted to add an edge profile while it was kind of still disassembled like this because it's just a little bit easier to manage the router rather than trying to do it when it's all standing upright. I'm using the same 1/8 inch roundover that we use on the tabletop, and this just kind of ties everything together, softens those edges up so that if you hit them with your knees while you're standing at the table, you're not going to be cutting your legs on them. Sometimes during a build, I get to thinking that maybe it's not worth it to add the edge profile, just to kind of maybe break those edges with some sandpaper so that they're no longer sharp, but I really do always end up being thankful that I do add it because I really think that it adds a nice touch and just looks the legs look a lot more complete overall. So back over to the base, we're ready for our final glue up, and this is how we're going to use those little pieces that we cut earlier. So the joints slip over together just like that, and after a little bit of glue, this joint was actually super strong. So went ahead and taped it off because all of our pieces were pre-sanded, threw a bunch of clamps on this thing, and we're ready to go. It was definitely a little bit of a detour on this table base that I was not planning on, or a happy little accident, as Bob Ross would say. But I actually really do like how this turned out, and I think it adds a little bit of intrigue to this base. And even though it's something that you probably won't see very often, I really do think it kind of looks nice. So I went ahead and used my chisels to just kind of break up those edges at a nice 45-degree angle on that, so that it kind of looks more complete in that spot. If you spent any time on TikTok or Instagram in the woodworking realm, you've definitely seen somebody brand their logo onto a piece. And that's very nice, but I went to go buy those things, and to get a custom logo is like $150. And that just seemed like a lot of money for something that nobody really cares about, but except for probably me. Plus, everybody seems to do a branded logo, so I thought it'd be kind of nice to just switch it up and do something a little bit different. Now, if somebody buys this table from the original owner, and 3 years down the road, looks at the bottom of it, they will know that somebody named Altered Grain Customs built this table. With my self-indulgent logo out of the way, it's time to move on to the final step of this build before we put our finish on. So what you'll see me doing here is adding some holes and recesses in the bottom of the base, and this is just going to allow for some bolts to attach from the base down into our tabletop. And quick tip, if you're ever drilling holes through wood like this, is to prevent tear out. I actually stopped the drill bit just a little bit short, and once I saw it poking through, I went through back on the other side, and you can see the difference between the holes that I drilled that way versus the one that I accidentally drilled all the way through. The next step was to get the base centered on the table, then mark out the spots for the threaded inserts that I'll use to attach the base with bolts down into the tabletop. So I got them all marked out and then drilled into the bottom to prep for my threaded inserts. This is always one of the most stressful parts of the build because I'm at the very finish line. I'm almost done with it, and then I'm drilling holes in the bottom of my tabletop, which has ended poorly for me in the past. I have drilled all the way through a table, which wasn't ideal, so I always use extra care to make sure that I don't drill too deep and just to drill just enough so I have room for the inserts, but not go all the way through. With that final step complete, it was time to move on to prepping for our finish. So I began by vacuuming off the whole piece, and you can see just how much sawdust is trapped in that wood still after sanding. So I went ahead and vacuumed it off and then hit it with some mineral spirits to get every last speck of dust off of there in preparation for our finish. The finish that I'm going to be using for the table is called Rubio Monocoat, and there's a good chance that you might have seen this before, but that is for good reason because Rubio is one of the best finishes out there, especially for a new woodworker, but even for professionals. It's a great finish because it offers a lot of protection and it's super easy to apply. Woodworking is definitely an art, but it's really not that complicated. I'm a self-taught woodworker, probably like a lot of people out there, and it's really not that hard to figure out how to use the tools, how to design projects, and stuff like that. It takes a little bit of learning, but I think most people could probably get there if they put their mind to it. That being said, wood finishing actually is rocket science because you will get so far down into a rabbit hole of all these different finishes and these like whole magazines from like the 90s that just go into like the thousands of different ways that you can finish wood. It becomes extremely overwhelming very quickly. So that's why when I say ease of application is very nice, I really mean it, because this Rubio is like a super simple process. You wipe on, you wipe it off, and you call it good. So call me simple, but that's how I got into using Rubio. I don't have to look at those 90s magazines at all, and it does a great job of protecting these pieces while also bringing out the natural beauty of the wood, like you can see here on this white oak as we finish applying the Rubio. There's still one more detail that I want to add to this table after we apply the finish to the base, but I want to take just a second here and thank you for watching and to open it up for any sort of feedback. I am still a new channel, and I will be putting out more videos as we progress forward into the future, so feel free to let me know what your thoughts are on this video or my previous videos, and let me know if there's anything else you'd like to see or parts of the builds that you'd like to see more detail on. So I'm all ears and I love any feedback that you might have. And if you really do enjoy my content, definitely subscribe to my channel so you don't miss any of the new stuff coming out. I love getting to apply finish to these joinery portions of the build because you really get to see the contrast between the two pieces, and it's just kind of a nice little nod to the handmade nature of the table. So I know a lot of people aren't a huge fan of joinery, but I actually really like it and think it adds a nice touch. But the final touch I want to do for this build is add some protection for the feet. So it's really frustrating when you have a wood table and it's sliding all over the place and scuffing up your floors. So something that I decided to try different on this project is actually do a leather foot. Since my pieces are custom and handmade, I like to try to think of unique ways to kind of make things a little bit different and to give the customers good value for their money. But I'm definitely not a leather worker, so if you are into that kind of stuff, probably just close your eyes for this portion so you don't have to see me struggle through this whole process. And with that, this table is all wrapped up. So last step is to attach the base to the tabletop with the threaded inserts that we did a little bit earlier. And this is a wrap. So thank you so much for watching this video. I'm super pleased with how this project turned out. I love the white oak and all the details of this build, but feel free to let me know in the comments what your thoughts are. And thank you again for watching, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on any of my videos that will be coming out in the future.